This is the Samsung T9, and this is potentially the best external SSD that you can buy, because this SSD advertises speeds of up to 2000 megabytes per second. That's 2 gigabytes per second read and write speeds. But there's actually a bit more to it. If you're planning to getting those speeds on a laptop, you're never gonna get them.
What the hell are you talking about?
Well, you'll have to find out.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out Whokeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out whokeys.com in the video description below.
So firstly, in the box, you get this SSD, which has actually a little bit of a nice, like a rubbery design on the outside. Like you've got a metal chassis inside, but then this rubbery one outside, and it's got a wavy kind of pattern on it. You can see it like in some of the angles there, which makes it a nice thing to hold in your hand. There's one USB-C port. It comes with 2 cables, USB-C to USB-C cable, and then a USB type A to type C cable. If you want faster speed, you're gonna have to use the USB-C to USB-C cable. In terms of the speed of the SSD, you're still gonna have to get a certain device that supports this particular USB-C connection, which is USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 slot, which I'll show you in a minute. In terms of the specs of this SSD, this comes up to 4 terabytes in capacity, 1, 2, and 4. The 1 and 2 are slightly slower in the write speeds of the SSD, but still advertise up to 2000 megabytes per second speeds. Samsung's got some great hardware for this if you want to password encrypt it or some of the other things for this. There's some great like security features for this as well as a up to 3 meter drop resistant durability feature, and it comes with 5-year warranty. Now, let's get some of the benchmark results out of the way first so you can actually see some of the test results. Firstly, let's have a look at Quick System Benchmark Test, which basically tests the drive as like a secondary drive, or if you just have a secondary drive in your system. And here, all of the other drives are actually internal drives where you use the M.2 slot in there. And the Samsung T9 here is right on the bottom of the chart at only 749 points, which actually averages about 93.2 megabytes per second. Now, looking at something like the Samsung 980 1 terabyte drive, which is actually a Gen 3 M.2 SSD, we're getting more than double the score in that. But bear in mind, this is external SSD, so they're not kind of comparable, but it still gives you a little bit of a result of what this would be like compared to the internal drive if you had the drive inside the drive. Which also brings me to another kind of a point here, is that having an internal M.2 is so much better than having an external SSD. Will be so much faster, as you can see in all of these results. So when you're building a PC, install the M.2 drives internally and you will not just get them cheaper, but also so much faster. But if you are editing on a laptop, which probably most people are doing when buying these SSDs, external SSDs, or as a creator, you need to transfer a lot of files, a lot of things externally, especially if you're running a MacBook or any of the Mac devices where you can't upgrade the internal storage, then I highly recommend my Mac storage guide, where I used some of the Samsung drives, internal M.2 SSDs drives, and show you how you can expand the storage perhaps even faster than what we're seeing over here. So I highly recommend go check out that guide out there. A lot of people have seen it and they've found it very helpful, but just so you know, have a look at that one as well before purchasing this. Let's move on to data drive benchmark. So this is PC Mark 10 data drive benchmark, and here we can see that the Samsung T9 again is at the bottom of the chart. You can see it's getting less than half the score of Samsung 980 1 terabyte drive, which is Gen 3 drive. So let's compare all of these tests to that one, and you can see that the internal drive is much faster than this external drive. In terms of the full system drive benchmark, the Samsung T9 is in the bottom there again, 783 score, and the Samsung 980 1 terabyte drive is almost 3 times as fast as what we have in here. The drive performance and consistency test, you can see that the Samsung T9 actually interestingly surprises some of the other drives. The T9 4 terabyte version over here is actually faster than the Solidigm P41 Plus 1 terabyte drive and the Samsung 980 1 terabyte drive. And why is that, you might ask? It's because This Samsung SSD has a fast, or what Samsung likes to call a turbo write kind of a spec. And even though Samsung labels it that way, this is what happens with every single external SSD that you're gonna have. There is this burst write kind of capacity that the SSD can write on. You can call it cache perhaps. And once that gets filled up, the SSD is gonna drop the speed and can write onto the SSD much slower. But this Samsung T9 has an incredible spec of that. So you can write for this 4TB drive 180 gigabytes before it's gonna drop the speeds. So if you're looking for a drive that can sustain the read speed or write speeds very long, in fact I think this is the fastest or the highest cache in terms of this that I can see. So you use SLC, like the faster reads onto the SSD at first. I don't know if there's any external SSDs that have higher than 180 gigabytes per 4TB SSD out there. Perhaps there is, I don't know of them, but this is very impressive, which means that if you are writing like your big Blackmagic Pocket cinema camera or any of the Blackmagic devices or some of the other cameras that can record onto the external SSD now, some of the Lumix cameras even now, you can take the massive file on your laptop or on your camera, or you write or you have written on this, and you can copy off it or onto it very fast with even super large file sizes. Now, if your files are less than 100 gigabytes, 50 gigabytes, 2 gigabytes, this is absolutely fine for this, and you're not going to notice this. And perhaps this might be a little bit of an overkill of an SSD for you if you're only using smaller files. But if you're using large files as a creator with big, large video files, for example, that get over 180 gigabytes, then this will really help you with the speeds and sustaining those speeds with read and write speeds. Now, the benchmarks, what you saw here, even though it doesn't look amazing and perhaps the speeds aren't as fast as internal SSDs, when we're looking at the external drives, then these are very impressive specs. And to get 2000 megabytes per second externally, that is quite fast. But there is a huge but. Samsung is using the USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 interface for this to actually transfer this, not USB 4, which they could have gone for as well, which basically means that it's not as popular in devices as a USB 4, for example. USB 4 has a better compatibility with like Thunderbolt 4 and some of the other devices that you see out there. For example, Apple uses USB 4 for their new MacBook Pros and some of the new Apple devices that have the M2, M3, chips. You can see the USB 4 is supported there, which you would get full, speeds of there if you were using this. But right now, you're not gonna get the full 2000 megabytes per second speeds, only when you're using this on a PC. In fact, I don't know any laptops that have a USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 slot as the USB-C slot on the laptop. I know a lot of Thunderbolt 4 or USB 4 or USB 3.2 ports that are 10 gigabits in speed, but not the 20 gigabit kind of in the middle there. What this will basically mean is if you copy any of the files on the actual USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 slot, like I was testing on my drive there, then I can get up to 1.7, 1.8 gigabytes, so that's 1800 megabytes per second roughly speeds when I'm writing onto it or copying off it, as you can see on some of the b-roll here where I'm just copying files off the drive and trying to absolutely maximize to see if it still utilizes, or how fast we can actually get it. But now let's say you do have a laptop that has a Thunderbolt 4 or that has a USB 4 port. What can you expect? So I have the Asus ProArt StudioBook over here, and this has 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports on the side here, which would be the same that you would have on your Mac or some of the other devices. Basically on Mac laptops it will be very similar. So I'm going to connect it to the USB-C cable, and so as you can see, I've got the T9 in here already and I've got some files on it. Firstly, when we're going to copy off it, and I've got a very fast Gen 4 NVMe inside there, so our internal NVMe is not going to be the bottleneck in here. So when we're going to be copying off there, you can see we're roughly reading from the drive about 1 gigabytes per second. If we're going to add a secondary file there as well, you can see that it's still not gonna go really above the 1 gigabytes per second read speeds of this SSD. Let's add a third one. roughly around 1 gigabytes per second. But now what about writing onto the SSD? So I've got another folder open on the T9, and we're gonna take those files on the desktop, and we're gonna take this one first, copy that one here. And you can see we're copying about 600, 700 megabytes per second. I'll take a bit of a larger file so it goes a little bit longer. It's writing onto the drive about 650 megabytes per second. Look, here in total we can get about 1 gigabyte. That was about 500, a little bit more than that, which is a lot slower that you saw on the PC, which basically means that you're only gonna get those 2000 megabytes per second, like up to those specs, when you're gonna have the USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 slot, which is awesome that someone has made an SSD for that, because I don't think there is any other there. And often when you see the 20 gigabits per second kind of speeds rated on the front panel USB-C on some of the PCs, I'm often saying, look, it's 20 gigabits per second, but there isn't actually a device that can utilize this. But this here can do that, which is awesome. But the downside is that for external SSDs, most likely, if you are using a laptop and you want to use this on the laptop, then you're not going to get those speeds on there on a laptop, which is a bit of a downside. The interesting thing is, the way this has been set up right now is that it's actually faster to use the USB Type A port that only supports 10 gigabits per second here, as you can see, this one here. And when you look at what I'm copying these over, I'm copying them over about 850 megabytes per second, which you remember is faster than the Thunderbolt 4 port, because a lot of those Thunderbolt 4 devices aren't very compatible with the, Gen 2 X2 spec of the USB 3.2 generation or interface, which is kind of a shame on a laptop where we could get much higher speeds. For example, I've got this Orico SSD here, which is USB 4 compatible device. So this is rated 40 gigabits per second, which this Samsung T9 could have done as well. But it just uses a different interface basically to connect. And I've got some files in here. And if I'm going to copy exactly the same kind of similar size file from there, Blackmagic Raw onto there, I'm seeing, look, it starts from 4 gigabytes per second to 3 gigabytes per second, but stays here now about 1.6, 1.7 gigabytes per second read speeds from the drive, which is pretty much double the speed what we can see what this Samsung is actually showing. But the Samsung can actually go still like the 2 gigabytes per second, but just because of the interface, it's just not as fast with that. But just because of the different support of USB devices, as you can see, Thunderbolt 4 to USB 4 is much better compatible to each other than a USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 slot. So that's why perhaps having a USB 4 external SSD might be a little bit better. So then, what do I say? Do I recommend this SSD or not? And interestingly, even though you've seen perhaps this review as a bit of a downside or bad side, I actually do recommend this device, and I think this is an absolutely awesome SSD. You just need to know the kind of limitations of this. If you know your device or your computer actually can support the USB 3.2 X2 or Gen 2 X2 slot, then you'll really get all the benefit of this one. And even if you're using an Apple, MacBook Pro or something like that, and you're using the previous Samsung T7 or T5 drives, T7 drives, let's say there, where it supports 10 gigabits per second, which is up to 1000 megabytes per second kind of read speeds, then this one has a much larger cache on the drive. So if you're using large files, then this T9 will slow down much later than the T7. If I'm not mistaken, the T7 is about 50 gigabytes compared to this 180. Now, don't quote me on that, but that is a huge difference between these two devices. So if you're copying and using very large files, for example, recording your camera onto the SSD like this, then this will actually be one of the best drives you can get. It's just a shame that this isn't USB 4, because that would be a much better option at this point, because I feel like the USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 slot, how many times have I said that, is kind of not as popular as USB 4 now. So that's just all. If you want to check it out, I'm going to leave the link in the description below. Have a look at this one, as well as the external SSD guide for laptops as well as Mac devices. If you want to use and make this potentially even cheaper, then check out that guide. I highly recommend you checking that out. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.